A few speakers. We're just going to go through them as quickly as can, and then at the end of it, we'll leave enough room open for questions. We're only going to do a short amount of questions, as you may understand that this is very tiring, and it's been very emotionally straining on this community and these leaders for being here. So English River is about 500 kilometers north of Saskatoon, located in northwest Saskatchewan. They're a signatory of Treaty 10, with most of the students that were in that community attending the Beauval Indian Residential School. This Indian Residential School also impacted over 15 communities in that region, including many of the Métis settlements and the First Nations communities together. So today we have speakers from English River, the Middle Lake Tribal Council, the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, the Métis Nation Saskatchewan, and the Office of the Treaty Commissioner. So to begin our press conference, we're going to have English River First Nation Chief Jenny Wolverine speak first. Thank you, Chief.
Thank you, Larissa. Do I speak into the mic? Or?
Yeah, just speak loudly for all of those.
Before we begin, I would like to ask everyone to join us in a moment of silence as we acknowledge the 93 children who never returned home. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jenny Wolverine. I'm the Chief of English River First Nation. And we come from the territory of Treaty 10. Today, I want to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. So welcome, visitors. I am joined by council members Katrina Morris, Randy McIntyre, and Sandra John. I would like to thank our elders for the pipe ceremony this morning. It's always a good thing to start off in a good way with prayer. I want to thank the elders for their prayer as we continue to go through this journey of healing. Thank you for honoring those lost children and their families and the communities. As we sit here today, I am reminded that in Winnipeg, in Treaty 1 territory, survivors from coast to coast to coast of residential schools have gathered. I pray for them and all the children who were forced to attend residential school and how it disrupted their lives and connections. A little bit about myself. I'm a Dene woman and live in the community of English River, signatory to Treaty 10 territory. And we are a unique community because we are composed of Cree and Dene, and also we have one road in and one road out. We continue to fish, to hunt, and gather and use the land as our elders and ancestors have taught us and continue to teach us. And from those traditions is far from the hustle and bustle in the city. We are all connected to the land. We know each other. We know each other's families. We know each other's children. We have a kinship system where we're connected by those beliefs and those traditions. We acknowledge what has been talked about for generations. We also know the impact of residential school to our communities. I am not a residential school survivor. I do, however, suffer from the effects and impacts because I do not speak the Dene language fluently. And that connection was lost when my grandparents and my parents attended residential school. I tell you that not for sympathy, but to show you how residential schools disrupted and continue to disrupt our connections. While the schools may be closed, the impacts affect us today through the loss of language, loss of culture, and loss of life. In 2021, English River started the process to look for our children that did not make it home from Indian Residential School. We were not sure what to expect and what we would find, but we did know the stories that were shared over generations about the treatment of these students and those students who never returned home. And from those stories, we had an idea of where to look. So we began there, based on the stories that have been shared in our communities. And what we found was heartbreaking and devastating. To date, there are 93 unmarked graves, 79 children, and 14 infants. We initially issued a press release that indicated that there were 83. However, the additional number was confirmed by the archaeologist when he placed the flags the day after the news announcement. Let me be clear that this is not a finality. This is not a final number. It breaks my heart that there are likely more, or even that there's even one. The experience of residential school is horrific. Coming to the decision to share the news was a way in which we did as an effort to share information and to ensure our members were cared for, that is consistent with our values, taking care of each other and the land through connection. The last few weeks, indeed, the last few months, have been an emotional roller coaster for our community. We appreciate the respect that was shown to our community. As a community and a nation, we came together and put our elders and survivors first. We did ceremony to help them come to terms to heal with their spirit. 16 communities in the Northwest are affected by this. In the last 2 weeks, we have come together. We have visited the graves, and some graves that have been marked, allowing family members and elders to pay their respects. Saskatchewan's Northwest is not like any other region in the province. Our families are tied together. Kinship is so important. We rely on our neighbors for survival. We ask that you understand these experiences. Stories about the treatment at residential schools, handed down for generations, are based on fact. We need you to understand the dark, stark reality and give it context as to the impact on individuals, families, and communities. The discovery of the graves earlier this month was just the first step in what will continue to be a long and difficult journey. There have been 93 potential finds, but we know that's not a final number. We must continue to search these sites for more of our loved ones. To do that, we need resources. We will be a united front together with First Nations and Métis communities and governments. Together, we will call on Canada and Saskatchewan governments to join with us. It doesn't all come down to dollars and cents. Excuse me. We need to have a holistic approach in our communities to the healing process physically, mentally, spiritually, and emotionally. Governments can help with all of that. It takes a whole community. We also ask Canada and Saskatchewan to accept the wrong, reflect in their approaches with Indigenous governments to ensure they are hearing our collective voices, and history never repeats itself. Acknowledge that cultural genocide, dehumanization of First Nations and Métis cultures of the past. Putting words into action, have the political will to implement the calls to action. We have heard, "I am sorry." Now we need to see action from that, and that means continuing to bring home the children we lost at the hands of residential schools. Before I close, I want to thank those leaders who are here today and those that are offered their prayers and support. We often say that English River and up north that it takes a community to raise a child. And it does take a community to raise a child. We support each other, and I'm thankful for our community and their communities. Nos tia ekwebenene, our ancestral lands. We will continue to make connections and heal as we have done since time immemorial. Marcy.
Thank you very much, Chief. I'm going to get you to switch positions with Dawn, or just actually scooch your chair over this way. Next up, we're going to have Dawn McIntyre. Dawn McIntyre is one of the coordinators with the GPR search. She'll have more of the technical and information numbers for you. Thank you, Dawn.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dawn McIntyre. I have been coordinating the GPR search along with a team of elders, elected leaders, community members, and GPR specialists. I would like to thank everyone who has come together in ceremony, providing prayers and sharing their stories, as this was invaluable as we went through the search. I would like to acknowledge and thank the two elders who are sitting here with us today, that they've come forward to give us strength as we talk about this very difficult subject. And I would also like to thank my husband, Bruce, who has been providing spiritual support and conducting ceremonies for the entire team throughout this whole process. In 2021, the English River First Nation began the work to do a search of the Beauval Indian Residential School grounds. The leaders of ERFN have taken on this huge responsibility on behalf of all of the communities that are affected. Many stories have been shared with families and friends about students who did not return home. Over the course of 2 years, we searched the grounds and completed the first phase of the search. The GPR findings have produced several positive hits or areas of interest at this site, which are consistent with what we now believe are 93 possible unmarked graves. Most, if not all, of these unmarked graves are believed to be children, and at least 14 of them are believed to be infants. And this is based on the measurements of the soil disturbances that were detected by the GPR. We used a combination of GPR technology, geoscience, and archaeological expertise in the search, and together they produced these results. I am from the Canoe Lake Cree First Nation, and I reside on the La Plonge Reserve, the English River First Nation, with my husband and my son. All of the small communities in the northwest region of Saskatchewan are interconnected, and all of the communities in the area and beyond are directly impacted by the Beauval Residential School. My late grandmother, Marguerite Iron, attended the Beauval Residential School during the 1920s. And my father, Norman Opikuku, attended the school during the late 1950s. The trauma that they and their fellow students suffered was brought home, and the impacts are obvious in our communities today. During this GPR search process, I have become acutely aware of how this school has impacted my own life. I am an intergenerational survivor of the Beauval Residential School. The intergenerational impacts of the Beauval Residential School are experienced not only by my generation, but also the youth, the children, and even the babies who are now being born into our Indigenous families. These impacts continue to affect us today. We are all living within an imposed cycle of trauma handed down by our parents, our grandparents, and our great-grandparents. This is because in our Indigenous culture, we experience our lives collectively. What happens to one Indigenous person has a ripple effect on the family, the community, and the entire Indigenous nation. A number of Beauval Residential School survivors from various communities collaborated, and they developed a collective statement to be shared today. I was asked to deliver this statement on their behalf, and I am honored to do so. So, in the words of the survivors, the GPR findings were shared with our local communities 3 weeks ago. There was an immediate effect on the survivors when they heard the news. Their immediate response was shock, and then there were tears, and there was anger. Many survivors felt re-traumatized, and many were triggered into reliving the horrific memories of their childhood. There are many survivors and intergenerational survivors who are right now feeling overwhelmingly immense sadness or even depression over the GPR findings. We, the survivors, call on all Canadians to acknowledge the truth of the full, horrifying history of the IRS system as a part of colonialism and its impacts. We, the survivors, have had to process the fact that these children and infants did not make it home. We are witness to the immediate families traumatized by the deaths of their loved ones in the IRS system. We continue to reconcile with the deaths of our loved ones who are still dying from unprocessed traumas of the IRS system and the intergenerational impacts. We, the survivors and our communities, have been and are burying our relations at an epidemic level, from drug and alcohol-related deaths, violence, and suicides. We are reconciling with this harm at personal, family, community, and nation levels. We, the survivors and descendants, are still struggling, processing, and reconciling the cultural genocide, dehumanization, and trauma from the state. We are at various stages of reconciliation and recovery. We, the survivors, call on all Canadians to acknowledge the policy of wardship and the separation of Indigenous children from their families and communities. There continues today to be collective incarceration of Indigenous children who experience physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual harm as part of the IRS legacy. Again, we call on all Canadians to acknowledge these truths. We, the survivors, wish to respond and process the re-traumatization using our own Indigenous protocols. Many survivors wish to reconcile individually through traditional ceremonies and memorials. We wish to turn to our ways to reconcile our self-concept and our Indigenous identity. The IRS system caused intergenerational and ongoing impacts. Canadian support is required for ways and means to address the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual harm. We, the IRS survivors, call on the federal government to properly provide for immediate resources for a culturally appropriate memorial for the unmarked graves, and to erect a commemoration monument detailing the history of the Beauval IRS system and its impact. And this is to ensure that IRS systems will never again happen in the future. We call on the federal government to provide permanent and sustainable funding for Indigenous healing centers, controlled and managed by Indigenous people, to address the intergenerational harm of colonization and the IRS systems, and to ensure that this is a priority of governments and churches. We call on the federal government to move forward in respecting Indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination and as sovereign nations, to implement Indigenous governance with our own Indigenous constitutions, acts, and laws. We call on the federal government to commit to true reconciliation, affirming Article 45 of the TRC call to action. We call on the federal government to respect the right to self-determination by providing capacity and resources to address housing, education, employment, and economic development from the Indian monies of the federal government consolidated funds. We, the IRS survivors, call on the Roman Catholic churches to respect Indigenous rights with regards to Indigenous culture, ways, and to provide the opportunity for spiritual reconciliation. And we call on the Roman Catholic Church to provide sustainable funding as committed to by the Roman Catholic Church to support and assist with the harm caused by the IRS system. We, the survivors, call on both the federal government and the churches to continue to sustainably provide for cultural competency training about colonization, including the IRS systems within the state. We call on the federal government and the churches to recognize the value of Indigenous involvement and participation toward healing and wellness practices, specialized treatment for Indigenous people by Indigenous people, and culturally relevant and appropriate ways. We call on the federal government and the churches to assist in strengthening Indigenous cultural and language rights revitalization and preservation. We, the survivors, call on all levels of governments and the churches to take action. Reconciliation is a Canadian problem, and the impacts of colonialism must continue to be addressed, and we must do it together. Finally, we ask that the government have the political will to see the TRC calls to action to reality. Indigenous voices must be heard to influence change, to transition out of colonial perceptions and systemic racism, so we can all move forward with the immense wealth of knowledge from the Indigenous people and their skills and their expertise and their ways that will help all Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. I'm just going to put the chairs all on down again. So our next speaker will be a Meadow Lake Travel Council Dene Vice Chief Lawrence McIntyre. Would you take the chair? Chief. There you go. You good?
Solotene, kutu, ajani deli, asi urin chose, kaya asani del. Ay no hayang tido kampi, no hati teneni lao, marsi heresese. Kusi Lawrence McIntyre kushese, barin charote dane hesling. Now, Treaty 10, I was Anna. I had to home. So was it. Now, Treaty Holy. You say, Crew, what a chain is a corner cane. Quen won't I. But in your tea, aha. That it's Agaha. A short ate, Bahanil Daroliha. Kulu, ayo yaga, honorest Arilanaya show bazi. Senior, they don't say at here, I asked he. Kulu, says Cano, say to Kazo, then Ade at Hilila. I have a hundred Larene, a honorest Ardon. Sans a pont enande. Hola, bagadot agonasa. Antu se cuida, se connect inde. Antu daragal au. Antu de asota sonze betaniede. Sain nahi. Nunai inlegi. Nunai inle. Edini danet ai. Bint azi. Nuhani jai, ayati. Nani di so laga begaye, hotedani delo, get kajadal begayotan. Tajadal nane design. Odonel kangulo, nani assist kinidan li halide. Eurot at the home, don't enter, but adalit a. But a so I no quindan li halide. No to Kazadan Lihale, no Scanadan Lihale, no Holot in a Dan Lihale, et Adar. A hill can hurry in there, some of the red identity to send her. A dinning hard name with Belzil Tio, and to Hanil the day, a Yoha. Kolo hunt ilede, I should have a deli, Asun datu hitale kon ne hase. No niti no khal no tse ni de ayorotu venail na. Edine no hane is na hare asiot a no ilese. Holani nanela don tao boni darote. Se konelten koe ho anale tu kaldesche. 1910 na tenut anundazayar. Bala yat kiada tede atijane se sone de nine the rayer. Get try nana hanai the ro. Hoto yit I 9 day. Sonzala 9 day yer. No holot in a. A yoko se helity. Dani be atebe yazdan li helity. Kaze hol try. A yit in 9 day ni. Nani be e adan yao. Be zia. A yat e. Nani di ai. Be chi kuidan li helity. Kulu. Tungu asani gela. Esenut aha. Dat u samogodre no rest ane stide godre nade de test ide no rest ane ayrotu menai naundasa. Ko nani holna hok en liuntuza dat u hase. Nani di se kui be koni delila ebe de chanede a. Look ane sa chogole au bonil dare. Na kenane san do e no ni dala do so thona na aze thage then it's ana undi hi yala ye san san be ni hon ya de chen no ya na ne kha orit ko yo ate so thona na so tha as na do tho le kyoto shele khuto aye Dins azal se kondila tansie. Na kedene ke anzaze ayo ade. Kuyi tanonet khaze dan de chanek e yagala. Kuti baha fane be bane de nonet kha. Kuti asu dan nade nane o to ane sa se ta nano to asu tai da nai. Ayiti dizi au kelosi no donet kaha. Asu anal danelese. Don't boni dar a ayo a. Don't boni daro a ayo rotse. Aya don't ani daily. I didn't know what no rest I. When only a si hari dilise. Banyat kire ut ade betore ailese. Nuni asi ut ade hoseha. E yer dat ube tano ni hati. Nani ti yetono ni la se kui kadare kane ti. E yiti betano ni hade ti. Asi ne chose no hunta. E yi a. Tu hunta net another daily. Another daily. Dan salot in it another daily. No let in it. Marcy Harris is it. It's a region on it, can't say. Yeah, Marcy Chop.
Thank you, Vice Chief McIntyre. Next up, we're going to have Tribal Vice Chief Richard DeRocher. Meadow Lake Tribal Council is comprised of 9, I believe, First Nations, which includes the English River First Nations. So it's the tie to Meadow Lake.
Good afternoon. Thank you to the elders this morning for the pipe ceremony. Thank you to the 2 elders this afternoon for the prayers to help us all through this difficult time. You know, as indicated by Chief Jenny this afternoon, there's a possibility of 16 communities that have suffered losses of 93 children and infants while at the Beauval Indian Residential School. On behalf of the Meadow Lake Tribal Council, We give our condolences to them 16 communities, to them 93 families. Although we don't know who those children are yet today, it is our destiny. It is the work that English River has started that's going to find the families of the 93 children. And rightfully and respectfully take them home to their communities spiritually, so they can have the proper ceremonies, the proper burials that they should have had they been at home. At this time, mental wellness is priority. Mental wellness of our survivors, of our elders, of all the people affected by the residential school era. I too went to residential school, but at a different time. I'm going to share some stories with you that maybe help you understand the trials that we as First Nations people go through, that went through family that went to residential school. My grandmother, who the mainstream society would call my great aunt, my real grandmother died on the year I was born. So my great aunt, who I call Kokum, Grandma, took in to be my grandmother. And about 15 years ago, I was in my 30s, just about 40 years old, and I went in to hug my grandmother, and she didn't wrap her arms around me. Her arms were to the side of her as I hugged her. My grandmother was in residential school for 9 years, since she was 5 or 6 till she was a teenager. Today, after much work, my grandmother can hug. It took me as her grandson to show her there is love. You can be loved. Imagine that. I ask society to imagine that in your family. If that was your grandmother. To the people that say residential school never happened, I invite you all into our communities, into our culture, and see the pain, and see the work that it takes to become normal, functioning families. The much work that our people are putting into it, and we're still not there. Not because of us, because of the rest of society. There's a young lady that was on her way home from Coal Lake to her home First Nation of Waterhen. She stopped on the side of the road to adjust her luggage. She was carrying some tires in her vehicle, as well just to stretch. Some gentleman pulled up with a tractor and a load of bales and threatened her for stopping on the side of the road. Threatened her with a firearm. These are the things that our communities, our people, have to go through every day. And yet society asks, what's wrong with you guys? I turn the question around. What's wrong with you guys? There is much work to do in our communities, but there's a lot more work to do in Canadian society. You have to understand, we are people. We bleed the same as you. We cry the same as you. We mourn the same as you. That's the message I want to bring here today, is that Canada has to acknowledge not only what happened in the residential school era, but what happens every day in the justice system, in the health system, in the hospitals, in the courts, the unjust that our people have. And yet, we're trying like darn to bring our children up in a good way, bring our grandchildren up in a good way. To continue my story about my grandmother, now I have a 30-year-old son who is our youngest child, me and my wife. We do not go a day without saying, I love you. That didn't happen to me overnight. That took a lot of work. You know, I see lots of good people that I've been acquaintance of for many years in northern Saskatchewan, northwest Saskatchewan, because we are unique. I have many friends in the north, and the friends I see struggling and the friends I see challenging their demons. It takes a lot of work. In closing, on behalf of our tribal chief, Richard Ben, on behalf of my partner, the Dene Vice Chief, Lawrence McIntyre, myself, the Cree Vice Chief for the Meadow Lake Tribal Council, our CEO, Gordon Iron, and the 9 chiefs I serve, we wish good outcomes for these 16 communities, for these 93 families. And we lend our support in the wellness, in the mental wellness aspect of things. We have staffed up for this because we know the work it's going to take for everybody to get better. With that, I'd like to thank the media this afternoon, thank Chief Jenny and her team for bringing this forth. Aho.
Thank you very much, Tribal Chief DeRocher and Tribal Chief McIntyre. We'll now bring from the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, Chief Bobby Cameron.
Iglanate salutena ne baharilio wale. Chief Jenny Wolverine and your council and your community members, all those survivors, both First Nations and Métis relations, every single one of you, our prayers to each and every one of you to heal. 93 friends and relatives, 93 young boys and girls were someone's children, grandchildren, and would have been someone's moshom, kokum, mom and dad, would have been robbed from their lives, taken from their lives, taken from their homes. Possible kokums and mushrooms there. That's a travesty in itself. No disrespect to the country of Ukraine, but we have a lot of problems here in our region of Canada, here in our traditional territories. We have big problems. If one of you can reach out to Justin Trudeau, or if you get a chance, tell him we have problems here that need to be addressed. We have the First Nation people of these lands and Métis people that need to be addressed. Their healing journey in their truest forms as they see fit. We have non-First Nation priests and nuns who are walking freely, who are rapists and murderers, walking out there. Here's the part that we face with as Indian people. If that was me, I did something 70 years ago, and they found that out, I'd have been thrown behind bars. We're calling on justice. And if the justice system doesn't do it, the God's justice will get to them. Because the hurt, pain, anguish, and suffering that they did to our young boys and girls is a sin. Thou shalt not kill. It's a commandment in any law, no matter your race, color, or religion. Thou shalt not kill. Boy, they're going to pay for it. They are going to pay for it, one way or another. Those people shouldn't be walking freely. We've heard it loud and clear from many of our treaty territories of what they want. To build healing and wellness centers at those exact locations. The government of the day can spend millions and millions of dollars building and rebuilding these residential schools. Even after some of them caught fire and burned to the ground, they still rebuilt. They can rebuild healing and wellness centers right at those exact sites. Like Chief Jenny Wolverine, I'm a descendant of survivors. The abuse and the torture we faced as young people was a direct problem of residential schools. Direct. So to the community of English River and all those affected, we stand with you, we stand in solidarity with you, we support you. And if need be, worst case scenario, last case scenario, but it's obviously your choice as a community, that we take legal action on the federal government to do those exact same things, to address all those intergenerational abuses that are happening here in 2023. The meth problem, the alcohol problem, the unnecessary deaths every month amongst our First Nations. To force them to build healing and wellness centers at those locations. To make those sites, those locations sacred, whatever each of these residential school sites see fit, that's what they should do. What we're saying as a federation, the direction shall come from directly from the chief and councils and their membership and those survivors. We don't know what they want, but we stand in solidarity. We stand here in support of them. Well, thank you all for being here on behalf of our federation. We've seen it time and time again. We've traveled to every single residential school site. We've heard from every single survivor that has attended these events and gatherings. We've heard it directly from them. Release those records and archives so we can begin to put the pieces of the puzzle together on who's who. Who are these children related to? Whose kukum and mushroom would have they been? A lot of work to do. A lot of work to do. So Justin Trudeau, step up, be a man, look after, and take the direction from English River and many other residential school sites across this country. Do the right thing. Do the honorable thing. We met with Minister Gary Ananda Sangari, and this was the same thing that we discussed, was this particular topic. And our direction to him was work with those communities, take direction from the survivors. To do it otherwise, you will fail. To think you know what's right, you will fail. Work with these survivors here. They know what's needed. On behalf of our executive, again, and our vice chiefs, thank you all. We respect you all, and to the community, we stand in solidarity with you. Ekusin.
Thank you very much, Chief Cameron. We're now going to ask the Métis Nation Saskatchewan Vice President, Michelle Leclerc, to say a few words.
Thank you very much. Tansei, Lanate, and good afternoon. I want to thank the elders, Margaret and Norman, for their prayers today. And I know that over the last couple of weeks, there has been a number of ceremonies that have taken place. So I want to thank those pipe carriers and other elders in our communities that have helped our communities in the beginning of healing. I want to thank Vice Chief Wolverine for her words, and her team, Donna McIntyre and all of their team, for the invitation, and we're grateful to be here today. My name is Michelle Leclerc. I'm the Vice President of the Métis Nation Saskatchewan, and we're also here to stand in solidarity with English River First Nations and those potential 16 communities that are affected by this announcement today. My heart is with the communities as the painful process begins and we come together to heal together. And we started the process of healing together over the last couple of weeks. It raises many traumatic memories, and this painful process begins, and we can come together and heal together. The impact of residential schools reaches right across Canada, as we all know. It's a dark part of Canadian history, and it touches First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. This is certainly the case in northern Saskatchewan, and in this particular case, with the loss of 93 children, 14 of which we understand were infants. For too long, we've had to tell the same stories. And as Canadians, we're starting to tell the same story around these unmarked graves. We started out with 215 unmarked graves. Everybody was in shock. It continues and continues and continues, where our communities have to find our own children. We have to find those kids. And the Government of Canada, as the Chief says, has to provide information from those schools in order for communities to be able to identify our own children. For too long, we've had to tell the story, as I say, children dying at the hands of the authorities and being buried without ceremony, hidden from history, from their communities, until now. And again, I will say, with the help of the federal government and the provincial government, with school records, maybe we can get to a point where we can identify who would have been Cookums and Mushums. There are many, many families with unanswered questions. Hopefully, these findings will provide answers and allow for healing and closure. As Chief Wolverine had alluded to, there's all sorts of stories that the elders are telling them where people are buried, who they might be, all of that. So we need to be provided some of those answers for healing and closure. Again, as Chief Wolverine has stated, there's still so much to be done before survivors and families of those who attended Beauval Residential School can find the closure that they so desperately need. Until then, the Métis Nation Saskatchewan stands in solidarity with the First Nations and with our own communities. Beauval is a community that there were Métis students that went there as well. So we stand together. Throughout history, First Nations and Métis people and families have seen that by coming together, supporting one another, and working together towards shared goals, we see success and advancement despite colonial policies. So again, we stand in solidarity with your community and with all of those 16 communities that potentially are affected. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vice President Michelle Leclerc. We're now going to have Treaty Commissioner Mary Culbertson speak. And then we'll open it up for questions.
Good afternoon. Anin Sigokin and Dejana Gazwin, Mary Muskla Culbertson, and Tunse Kizikus and Treaty 4. My name is Mary Muskla Culbertson. I'm from Kizikus First Nation in Treaty 4. I'm the Treaty Commissioner of these territories. And we bring our support and our solidarity with the communities and the survivors and the elders affected, and with the survivors and GPR team and the coordinators, and with Dawn and her elders. We offer support through searching through archives, through trying to access Catholic school records. And at every step of the way, it has not been easy. You still have bureaucratic processes that stand in the way, or Catholic churches and other religious entities that rely on Canadian law to protect the records that they have. Those records should be public information. Right now is the time of year where everyone's taking their kids back to school, getting them ready. Imagine for the people who are watching, and yourselves in this room of our reporters and settlers, your 4-year-old going to their first day of kindergarten next week, and you're not going to see them until June. Imagine your 4-year-old waking up crying because it's their first night away from their mom and dad, and there's nobody there to hold them. There's nobody there to wipe their tears, and that continues for months. Imagine your child not coming home in June, and nobody can tell you what happened. Imagine this continuing for over 100 years, and nobody believed our survivors. Nobody believed our oral history. Now they do. We support the call by the special interlocutor to criminalize and make a hate crime the denialism of residential schools and the genocide that has taken place. There's people who will literally deny and try to show up with shovels when these announcements are made because they want to prove there was nothing done wrong. These schools operated until 1996. 1996. We've heard the countless stories as being Indigenous people when you're growing up and in your communities. You hear it from your relatives, you even hear it from your parents. And you think everyone in this country knows it. And then you find out growing up, nobody knew it. Nobody knew what's happening in that school in Lestock across the road from that farm. Nobody knew what's happening at St. Philip's across from that farm, but everybody drove by there every day. We've had children not return. We've had babies being born. What kind of circumstances were those babies born and murdered under and hidden. These are ugly truths that we have to come to grips with in this country. Whether we like it or not, this is happening. These are being unveiled. And Canada, with all its human rights records for helping other people, we sure don't look in our own backyard enough. And as a treaty commissioner, it's a very colonial position. The treaty commissioners came to these territories and negotiated with the First Nations to settle here, to share the land. They promised a treaty right to education so their children would be schooled in the ways of the white man so they would know what was coming. But they wanted their children to keep their culture, their language, their identity, to know who they are. And none of that happened. Instead, we got residential schools. We went from knowing who we were, speaking our languages, living off the land, to being put in residential schools. Murders, deaths, disease. I cannot say this enough, that it's all our responsibility as people who live in this country to educate ourselves, take advantage of the resources. They're everywhere now. On September 9th, we're hosting a free screening of Bones of Crows, and that's with Nutrien, so we can educate the people who live here in this city. Come watch Bones of Crows at the Roxy. It'll give you a little glimpse of what that woman went through. There's so many resources out there. There's survivors. Talk to them. Educate ourselves and each other. And as a treaty commissioner, I feel like I have to always constantly keep apologizing for those broken treaty promises. And so we all have that responsibility as people who get to live on this land to make amends and to try rectify those broken treaty promises. And these governments need to do the right thing. They need to step up, because these stories aren't going to stop coming. These tears aren't going to stop being shed. They get to hold their children at night. They get to kiss them, they get to hug them. Many of our people did not have that opportunity, nor did our parents feel that love. I'd like to offer our support more, as much as we can, whether it's having to battle with these dioceses, the churches, for English River, for the countless schools that have come asking, where do we go now? What do we do next? So with that, I'd like to say, Miigwech, thank you for the people who are watching. And we support and stand with the survivors and the staff of the English River GPR project. And sadly, this probably won't be the last time we're going to be talking about this.
Thank you very much. We'll open now for a couple of questions. Just we're running over time here. Again, please, with sensitivity at heart, we'll have Dawn and Chief Wolverine answer your questions. I'll pull this chair out of here. You two ladies could just go squeeze into the microphones there. Is there any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Would there be any archaeological or any plans of archaeological digs just to determine in order to get the remains and identify those babies or those children?
At this point, I think we're going to try to rely on the records that we have been able to obtain and whatever else we can get. If we can find out as much information from the archives as possible, we would only consider exhumation as a last resort.
Can you explain a little bit, apologies for my not knowing exactly the area around the residential school. I know this process was probably long and difficult. Can you explain a little bit about the region where you were looking in relation to the residential school? Was it right by it? Was there a church nearby? Just like, give an idea.
Throughout the history, the site where the residential school was just a residential school, there were buildings and houses that housed staff and workers, and it was a cemetery. Our search for the first phase was primarily conducted in and around the cemetery.
And it was unmarked kind of areas in there?
There were a number of unmarked graves within the cemetery that were all quite small. there were no headstones, no crosses.
I believe there's a lady down here.
Can you just explain a little bit more about how when we wrote that they're children and these are their working processes and how that they're identified?
From what I understand, with the GPR, the ground penetrating radar detects changes in the soil. So they're able to actually get, the data is able to provide a 3D image of the soil. So there's shapes, there's shapes that are exactly in the shape and size of graves. The advantage to what we did here, being in an actual cemetery that did have some marked graves, they're able to compare and find that these unmarked graves are very consistent with the marked graves. So they look exactly the same.
Do you want to just give them a link?
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, yeah, the measurements were identified as child size, or to use a technical term by the geoscientist, was sub-adult in size, so like less than 5 feet. And then the infants, there are 14 places where they look like graves to be about 2.5 feet in length.
Was this cemetery area solely used by this residential school, or was it like something else? It was a community
It was solely a residential school cemetery until the early 80s. And then it became a community cemetery after that.
Go ahead, one more.
To Chief Jen, how are the survivors holding up, especially right under the recent assault?
I can't speak for them, but I know that they are hurting and suffering, and I don't really want to speak for them. I
One more
apologize.
question? Go ahead.
These are pretty great findings at this time. So what are the next steps?
What's next?
Oh, the next step would be, so phase 2 is going to be continuing the search. There are more areas within the residential school grounds that have been identified by our survivors' stories that we need to look at. So we'll do more searching with the GPR, as well as continuing the analysis of the records, which is going to take some time.
We're going to wrap it up, guys. We have quite a few survivors that are in the boardrooms here as well that we don't want to take up too much of their time. So if we could get our elders to say a closing prayer to send everybody home in a good way.
We're all together.